everybody. My name is Xiang Chong. I'm a designer at Respawn Entertainment. Welcome to my talk, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, also less pretentiously known as the evolution of Rodeo in Titanfall. So quick reminder, please turn off all your cell phones. We got a lot of ground to cover and only 60 minutes to do so, so we're just going to get right to it. So, what is Rodeo in Titanfall? Well, in case you've never played the games before, but for some reason are still interested in this talk, the Titanfall series of games are first-person shooters featuring acrobatic, wall-running pilots dueling massive armored titans on the battlefield. One of the signature moments of the game is something we call Rodeo, where crafty pilots can sneak up on unsuspecting titan and jump onto their back. So in Titanfall 1, pilots rip off an access panel, and they shoot the exposed circuitry to deal heavy damage. In Titanfall 2, however, Rodeo becomes a cat-and-mouse game of the pilot stealing a Titan battery, taking a chunk of the Titan's health, and then the Titan frantically hunting down the pilot to get the battery back.
Pilot, your Titan is standing by. Call it when ready.
So what I'll do during this talk is give a highlighted tour of the history of Rodeo. It won't be an exhaustive list of everything we tried with Rodeo, otherwise we'd be here all day, but we'll cover the major milestones along the way. Provide some insight about the unique design challenges for Rodeo. Not many other games feature classes as distinct as Pilot and Titan, and making Rodeo be a satisfying mechanic for both has actually some surprisingly difficult constraints, which we'll go further into. And lastly, we'll go into what we think went well as what we think went poorly with Rodeo. Specifically, we'll talk about some of the rationale behind the huge changes we made for Rodeo between Titanfall 1 and 2, and why we think it makes for better gameplay. Incidentally, what this talk will not go into is any in-depth details of the technical implementation of Rodeo, so if you're hoping to get details for that, I'm sorry to disappoint. But in the beginning, back in August 2012, what was eventually going to be Titanfall was slowly but surely taking shape. After spending years prototyping several concepts, we decided to focus on two classes for our multiplayer-only game: wall-running, double-jumping, super acrobatic pilots, and giant mechanized weapons of destruction called Titans. And the idea was that players would start the game in a Titan, and then when it got really hurt, they could eject away and get a second life as a pilot. An early idea we had was, what if a pilot could jump onto the back of a Titan and do heavy damage to it? And we called the idea Rodeo. Rodeo was supposed to give pilot players another meaningful way to interact with enemy Titans, other than just shooting at them from afar like a typical FPS. And the picture you see here was painted by one of our designers, Jeff Smith, early on to give an idea as to what this David versus Goliath moment could look like. So that was our first design goal for Rodeo: give a way for pilots to meaningfully interact with Titans, potentially doing heavy damage to them. Of course, we didn't have the entirety of Titanfall designed back when we first started implementing Rodeo. As work on the game increased, so did our understanding of what it was we were making, and our understanding for what other goals needed to be hit for Rodeo. I'll come back to these goals as I show you the various iterations of Rodeo we had and how they were trying to do different things. So, the very first major iteration for Rodeo had pilots immediately pop into place on the back of a Titan when they jumped near the Titan. After a short amount of time, an explosive would be planted on the Titan, which would blow the Titan up. So as you can see, this iteration is super bare bones and simple, but even then it quickly revealed a ton of issues that Rodeo had to contend with that weren't immediately obvious. And the first and most glaring issue was that of communication. How do you tell the Titan player what's happening? So it's a first-person game, and the Titan player literally can't see that a pilot player is jumping on your back and what they're doing once they got there. As a pilot player, the problem is less apparent since Rodeo is pilot-initiated, and the animations and effects should convey what's going on, but since Rodeo is a fairly unique element to Titanfall, there's still quite a bit of a learning curve involved. Next, once they understand what's going on, what should both sides do once Rodeo starts? Clearly, it would be ideal if the Titan player could somehow react to what was going on, and meaningful choices could be made on both the pilot and the Titan that would affect the outcome. Lastly, how long should the entire sequence take? Too long and it would distract from the main combat of the game, but too short and you wouldn't be able to give the beats it deserved as a cinematic moment. Of course, these aren't the only problems with Rodeo, but these are issues at the heart of Rodeo that all versions of Rodeo have to contend with and solve. So with that in mind, let's take a look at how the first iteration of Rodeo looked like from the perspective of the Titan. So, as mentioned, this first major iteration of Rodeo was implemented without us fully understanding the issues involved, but it's useful for us to take a look at how it addressed those issues as a baseline we can use for future Rodeo attempts. Firstly, communication. Since this first major iteration of Rodeo, we've handled this problem primarily through HUD elements and sound. These are the first and most obvious things to try. And while they're not perfect, they kind of do the job. When the pilot climbs on, the Titan gets HUD elements on screen saying, "You are being rodeoed." This is true even in the final shipped versions of Titanfall and Titanfall 2. Second, choice. So for the pilot, once Rodeo starts, the sequence completes without any further input. However, the pilot can also choose at any time to cancel the process by manually jumping off. For the Titan, they've needed to find some way of removing the pilot before Rodeo is completed, otherwise they die. Other than having a teammate shoot off the pilot for them, the two main ways the Titan could remove the pilot were to disembark from the Titan and shoot the pilot off manually, or use electric smoke. And a quick sidebar, in case you didn't already know, electric smoke was a Titan ability that, as the name suggests, deploys a cloud of lightning around the Titan that zaps anyone in its immediate vicinity. You can see how this would be useful for the Titan to get the Rodeo pilot off his back. At this stage of the game, however, it was kind of like a super move from Street Fighter, so you had to charge up a bar before you could deploy it, so the ability to kill Rodeo pilots with it was somewhat limited. Length. So this iteration of Rodeo lasted about a total of 6 seconds, and our playtest revealed that this was probably a bit on the short end, as it gave little time for the Titan to react to what was going on before they died. But that said, from the playtest, we were also pretty confident it shouldn't take 30 seconds or so to complete either, so that gave us a range of maybe about 10 to 20 seconds or so as probably an ideal window as to how long the process should take. So, even though this version of Rodeo clearly had lots of things to improve on, it's important to focus and see if it did what it set out to do. Did it give a way for pilots to meaningfully interact with Titans, potentially doing heavy damage to them? And I think that yes, we could agree we did indeed hit this design goal. Pilots can now jump up onto Titans and blow them up with an explosive. However, having Rodeo be a binary outcome where the Titan was either totally destroyed or totally undamaged was kind of unsatisfying. When the Titan won, the pilot could feel like all his hard work in getting up close accomplished absolutely nothing. When the pilot won, the Titan was instantly destroyed, and this was counter to the idea that players could feel safer in a giant armored Titan. And on top of that, there was a desire for more player choice in the sequence. Having it just be a canned animation sequence for the pilot wasn't quite ideal, and Titan players wanted more ways to get the pilots off their backs. So that led us to the next major design goal for Rodeo. Make Rodeo be a process with a more dynamic range of outcomes affected by player choices and skill. And the next iteration of Rodeo had you holding down a trigger to do a steadily increasing amount of damage to the Titan. The idea was that pilots would have a special Rodeo drill weapon that you could take out during Rodeo, and holding down the trigger would activate it. So note that while the presentation for this is really rough, it's actually not too far mechanics-wise from the final version of Rodeo that we shipped with in Titanfall 1. You can also see the inspiration from the original piece of concept art that I showed earlier. And this is how it looked like from the Titan's perspective. So, how did this version compare to the previous one? With regards to communication, once again, primarily through HUD elements and sound that we tell Titan pilot what's going on. Since the drill process was a continuous process as opposed to the previous discrete process, that gave more time for effects and sound, etc. to be played, which helped the communication process for the Titan. For choice, this time around, the pilot had to choose to fire their weapon instead of being locked into a fully animated sequence. Now, in this iteration, we only started giving the Titan the warning that they were getting rodeoed when the pilot started firing the weapon. So there was an element of when the pilot should start firing the weapon for maximum effect. Ideally, you'd start firing when the Titan was already distracted fighting other players. For Titans, not much changed. The two main choices remain to disembark and shoot the pilot off, or to use electric smoke. Length. This iteration of Rodeo had a variable length, but to take the Titan from full health to 0 lasted a bit longer than before, about 10 seconds or so, although this was more easily tweakable than before by adjusting the amount of damage that the drill weapon did. Now, did we hit the design goals of this iteration of Rodeo? First goal was still preserved, so we'll check that off. And for the second goal, having the damage to the Titan be applied over time made for a vastly increased dynamic range of outcomes for Rodeo. It let Titan players who were good at getting Rodeo pilots off escape with minimal damage, while letting Rodeo pilots who failed to kill the Titan still feel like they did something. So yeah, we'll call that a success. And while this version of Rodeo playtested fairly well, the presentation needed a lot of work. It also didn't help that we were technically unable to do the next step of putting an actual gun into the pilot's hands while rodeoing. The code features we needed to really sell this feature just weren't quite there yet. At this point in development time, however, we were running very close to an internal milestone. We needed to be able to present the game at an internal EA marketing event, and the current form of Rodeo was way too far from being showable. This was especially pressing because we were trying to sell the concept of a cinematic multiplayer for Titanfall. So that led us to the next major design goal for Rodeo. Make Rodeo be visually compelling. This next major iteration of Rodeo we tried involved planting shaped charges that we called cabers on the back of the Titan after you had jumped on. It would take multiple cabers to finish off a full health Titan. The Rodeo pilot would have to aim at specific spots to plant the charges, and the spots would be semi-randomized. And the Titan player could also affect the aim of the Rodeo pilot by dashing around. And this is how it looked like from the Titan's perspective. So once again, we'll take a look at how this version of Rodeo addressed the issues before. Communication, primarily through sound. In this version, we had actually removed the big flashing, "You are being rodeoed" warnings as part of a conscious response to feedback that there was always too many things on screen in our crazy, chaotic game. You could hear a thunk as each caber was planted, but that was about it. Playtesting did show, however, that we really did need some kind of visual element on the screen to tell you that rodeo was being done to you, so we eventually brought it back. Choice. From the pilot's perspective, this was kind of like a mix between iterations 1 and 2. Instead of a single planted explosive, the pilot chose to plant as many as they wanted before jumping off and detonating them all. If the player died before jumping off, however, all the cabers would just disappear. Not much change with regards to the Titan. They could still use electric smoke or disembark and shoot off the pilot. Lastly, length. This iteration of Rodeo was definitely slower than the previous iterations. It took about 15 seconds or so to plant enough cabers that the Titan would die from them. Same thing as before. Let's look to see if we hit the design goals. The first and the second design goals were still intact, so we'll check those off. And this version of Rodeo definitely looked more polished than the previous one, and we successfully demoed it at the EA marketing event. So yeah, we'll say we hit that goal. However, internally, playtest feedback suggested that this version of Rodeo was kind of too much like a minigame. Planting the cabers at random spots had to be taught, and as a multiplayer-only game without a single-player campaign, mechanics that needed to be taught were kind of already at the limit. And that led us to the next major design goal for Rodeo. Make Rodeo be accessible. So given the feedback from iteration 3, we decided to revisit iteration 2 and actually do the technical work needed to finish it up. We put in code features to properly handle putting a weapon in the player's hands while they were attached to the Titan. And the player then needed to shoot his weapon at a weak spot on the Titan.
Bring it down.
Okay, your Titan's set for launch. Call it when ready.
So we were still harboring the idea that when the Titan player knew that he was being rodeoed, he could throw off the aim of the pilot on his back by dashing around and smashing themselves into walls, etc. So we made the weak point a relatively small area on the Titan. We had art make us a little hatch panel that we attached to the Titan, and then we had animation and damage effects for ripping it off and shooting into it. And our initial playtests were pretty positive. It felt like we had finally struck the right balance between it being fun, easy to understand, accessible, and it being cinematic. There were a few annoying lingering issues with the view of the Titan strongly affecting the view of the rodeo pilot. So when the Titan dashed around or when he turned rapidly, the pilot's view would kind of lurch right along the sudden jolt of motion. And it sometimes made Rodeo maybe somewhat nauseating, but generally we thought, this is it, this is what Rodeo is going to be like. Unfortunately, fixing the view issues took some time, and we were running really close to our ship date, so we decided to shelve any attempt to try and have the Titan stashing around throw off the aim of the Rodeo pilot. This is the perspective of the Titan.
Warning, hostile pilot detected on board. Recommend you disembark and remove the threat manually. Warning, enemy pilot detected on board. Recommend you disembark and remove the threat manually.
Oops. So once again, we'll run through the list of issues. Since iteration 4 is pretty much a more polished version of iteration 2, you can expect that this part is going to be pretty similar. Communication, primarily through HUD elements and sound. However, with the addition of a hatch panel and the brains of the Titan, we made Rodeo more grounded. There was an actual physical thing that pilots ripped out and shot at. This helped sell the concept of what was going on to the pilot a lot better. It also gave us the gameplay benefit of the first Rodeo attempt on the Titan taking longer to start up, as the panel had to be ripped out first, but subsequent attempts would let the pilot start shooting immediately. Choice. So with regards to the pilot, this was very similar to iteration 2. However, the hatch panel having to be removed before the pilot could fire the weapon was an additional prerequisite to be fulfilled. For the Titan, we enhanced their existing choices. First, by this time, electric smoke had become a regular Titan ability that could be used on cooldown, so it became much more effective of a counter for Rodeo. Secondly, to help players disembark and shoot the pilot off, we made the player's auto Titan kneel down if it was being rodeoed. So this is a video that shows that. So before we added this functionality, however, when rodeoed, the player's auto Titan would keep trying to face the pilot on its back shooting it. So, you know, it kind of had about as much effect as a dog chasing its own tail. Since the auto Titan now kneeled, it was much easier to shoot the pilot off, and it also gave us a way to visually communicate from afar that the auto Titan was getting rodeoed. Length. So this iteration of Rodeo had a variable length, but to take a Titan from full health to 0 lasted about 15 to 20 seconds, which is the longest of all the iterations we had so far. As mentioned before, this is about long enough for Titans to react to what's going on and for us to sell the cinematic experience of it, but not too long where it starts to drag on like a separate minigame. Did we hit the design goals? First goal is definitely intact. In fact, at this point, since we had added the concept of shields to the Titan, we made Rodeo damage bypass the shield, and that increased the strategic value of doing Rodeo as opposed to just firing an anti-Titan weapon normally. The second goal is intact as well, just by the nature of letting how much damage a pilot does be dependent on how long he stays on the Titan, which can be affected by both pilot and Titan choices. And we hit the third design goal too by doing a bunch more presentation work, having the technical feature to have a player hold onto a gun while rodeoing, having a hatch panel that reacted to being shot. It all helped to sell the experience. Lastly, accessibility. We think that Rodeo in Titanfall 1 is actually pretty accessible to new players. The only inputs involved with Rodeo as a pilot are 1. Jump towards a Titan, and 2. Shoot your gun at a weak point. These are actions we ask the player to do in the rest of the game, and as such, it's actually very feasible that a player with no information whatsoever can stumble upon Rodeo during the course of normal gameplay and understand instantly how to play it. It's admittedly less accessible from the Titan's perspective, but we've done things like make the Titan OS call out when you're getting rodeoed, and even advise you to disembark and remove the pilot from your hull. Overall, I think the accessibility of Rodeo is a big win. At this point in time, we've arrived at how Rodeo shipped in Titanfall 1. I think it's appropriate to take a step back and reflect a bit deeper on some of the things we thought went well with Rodeo and not so well. Firstly, and most importantly, Rodeo proved to be popular with players in Titanfall. Far and away, the most important thing when you're developing a new mechanic is if players enjoy it or not. While internal playtest feedback is often a good barometer for success, nothing beats actual player feedback. There's plenty of YouTube videos of epic Rodeo moments, and sentiment on Rodeo is generally positive, so we'll treat that as a win. Balance. General sentiment in the community is that Rodeo is fairly well balanced. Even among high-level competitive players, there's a bit of a divide between whether pilots or Titans have the upper hand when it comes to Rodeo, with some really powerful tactics available to both pilot and Titan players in a 1v1 situation. So for example, Titans can use the cluster missile and crouch looking upwards to pin the Rodeo pilot with their backs against the wall until kill them from the explosion, at the cost of heavy damage to themselves. pilots can jump on, and instead of just shooting their weapon into the weak spot, they can attempt to call down a warp fall Titan on their opponent, eliminating both Titan and pilot in one quick move.
Bring it down.
So we'll take the fact that Rodeo is deep enough to support multiple advanced tactics as a win too. Returning back to what went well for Titanfall 1's version of Rodeo, fantasy fulfillment aspect. David versus Goliath is always a popular trope, and Rodeo evokes that imagery very well. Another thing that went well with Rodeo, organic interactions with the Titan eject system. Ejecting from your Doom Titan onto the back of a Titan who is shooting you is a very satisfying highlight in our game that happens as a natural result of both systems working as intended. So this is a short clip from our E3 reveal trailer showcasing the moment from ejecting from your Titan into a Rodeo. The other interaction that comes with eject is when you eject from your Titan and when an enemy player is rodeoing you. Both you and the rodeo player are thrust high into the air when you can have an epic duel while falling down. This is a lot more deliberate than the first interaction. It had plenty of bugs, but we think the end result was very much worth it. This is a clip from YouTube that showcases that moment.
Enemy pilot detected on hold.
Tech 6 to all pilots. We're cracking the...
So, lastly, since we allowed players in the same team to rodeo their teammates, or as we like to call it, Brodeo, there's a number of interesting interactions that result. First of all, since only one person can be rodeoing a Titan at a time, Brodeoing blocks enemy rodeo attempts from happening. Secondly, Brodeoing is a great way for a Titan to quickly ferry pilots to destinations. For example, in CTF, since Titans can't carry flags, a popular tactic is to have your pilot teammate pick up the flag, have him jump on a Titan teammate, and have the Titan carry the pilot quickly to the flag cap base. And so here I picked a video from YouTube showing the Brodeo Flag Cap and how excited the players are to pull this off.
Oh wait, I got Titan as well.
There's a guy coming, there's a guy coming.
I'm gonna jump on you, I'm jumping on you.
Oh my god, this is amazing!
Go.
This is so good! Oh my god! Oh, I did not think of this! I did not think of this! I did not... Oh, that is brilliant, I love it. Titans are made for this game mode.
Oh shit, there's a guy there.
Come on, go, 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 right in the window! Go, go!
Clear of your Titan.
Oh, get in there! Get in! Right, come back, do it again, do it again.
Alright.
Oh, there's...
So to encourage this teamwork element of Rodeo, we even added a feature where as long as the Titan carrying the pilot has shields, any damage that the pilot passenger would take is passed on first to the shields. And these small things add a very much needed amount of teamwork in the game. So now that we've patted ourselves on the back a bit, it's time to be a bit more harsh and look at what we think went poorly for Rodeo. First, the back and forth between the Titan and the pilot could be improved. Note that even though we previously said that Rodeo supported a wide range of high-level tactics, there's generally a lack of meaningful things that the Titan player can do as a Titan. Electric Smoke as an option is the loadout choice, but when activated, it really doesn't offer much in the way of interesting gameplay beyond, activate it and then wait for the pilot to die or jump off. The cluster missile yourself in a corner tactic is kind of awkward, and it's a sign that there isn't really a better option for Titans to do. Getting out from your Titan to shoot the pilot is a valid option, but having to disembark feels like a bit of a concession that you don't really have an option as a Titan. In addition to that, in our in-office playtest, once the Titan player hears the kutunk from the Rodeo pilot climbing on, the Titan player often disembarks immediately and tries to shoot him off. The Rodeo pilot then tries to jump off and take out the newly disembarked player, or he hides somewhere, and this can lead to a very frustrating game of get out, get in, get out, hide and seek for the Titan player. And this YouTube video shows this loop of the player getting out of the Titan, getting back in, repeat. So he gets out, there's a dude on him, he jumps off, he's like, okay, I guess I'm getting back in my Titan. Gets back in, he notices the guy's still on his back, and he's like, all right, fine, I'm getting out. He tries to shoot him, and the rodeo pilot jumps again. This time he fakes going back in before actually shooting the pilot off. So another thing that went poorly for Rodeo, aiming during a Brodeo. We talked about Brodeo having useful applications, but actually staying on top of a friendly Titan and trying to shoot a target can be an exercise in frustration. Titans move at a really fast clip, and a lot of the screen of the Brodeo player is taken up by the model of the Titan, which makes it very hard to shoot anything accurately. Last of all, readability. As mentioned before, Titans can move really quickly, and only one person can rodeo a Titan at a time. Sometimes when you turn the corner and see an enemy Titan close by, you just jump out in reaction. It's hard to see sometimes though if the Titan already has somebody rodeoing him, and if it does, it often ends in the pilot's untimely death as he gets squished by the walking Titan. This is a constant source of frustration. Alright, so that was how Rodeo was developed in Titanfall 1. We're about halfway into the top. How's everybody doing? Alright. So hold on tight, because now we're going to go into the story of how and why we did Rodeo in Titanfall 2. So even though we clearly understood that Rodeo in Titanfall 1 wasn't perfect and could be improved, that still doesn't quite explain why we decided to totally change Rodeo drastically from Titanfall 1 to Titanfall 2. As a reminder, we went from this.
Bring it down.
To this.
Great move. Now take it down.
And this is the view from the Titan's perspective.
Warning, there is a hostile pilot on the hull. Warning, enemy attacking.
So to give some context as to why we changed Rodeo the way we did, we first need to get some history in an experiment we did to Titan health. In an effort to have a better sense of pacing during Titan fights, we tried a system where instead of having shields, Titans had a series of health Chiclets. These health Chiclets would regenerate over time, much like shields did in Titanfall 1, but once a Chiclet was gone, that portion of health was lost permanently. The idea was that it would give players a sense of when they could play aggressively when a Chiclet was full, and when they should play defensively when the Chiclet is low. When the player lost a Chiclet, the Titan would get a short period of invincibility, similar to getting knocked down in fighting games like in Street Fighter. It would allow the victim some time to breathe, recover, and plan what to do next. So, if you look at the top of the screen, you notice that the blue health bar is divided into 3 sections, or the Chiclets as we call them. You can also see that the enemy health bar in yellow is similarly divided into 3. So notice that as we fire on an enemy Titan, as long as we don't do enough damage to cross the Chiclet threshold, you will be able to regen all the health you lost. But once you cross the Chiclet threshold, the enemy becomes temporarily invulnerable, and he has a shield to protect him. Once the invulnerability fades, that first health Chiclet, you can damage the Titan again, but that first health Chiclet of health is now permanently lost. And he only regens up to the second Chiclet. So, unfortunately, the health Chiclet system did not play very well with Rodeo at all. Since you could regen all the damage you took until you lost a Chiclet, it became a very common occurrence that Rodeo wouldn't do enough damage to finish off a Chiclet, which meant the pilot player didn't do any lasting damage at all. And this was made worse by the fact that under the Chiclet system, Titans didn't have a concept of a normal shield anymore, which meant that the Rodeo damage, which bypassed the shield, wasn't as advantageous anymore as compared to regular damage. The invulnerability period also played havoc with the pacing of Rodeo. The early iterations of the health Chiclet system gave the Titan a dome shield for a few seconds, and that's the red shield that protects the Titan during Titanfall, that also does damage to enemies inside it. It also forcibly threw the Rodeo pilot off the Titan to avoid the pilot getting killed by the dome shield we gave the Titan. Eventually, for other reasons, we stopped giving the Titan a dome shield, but we still gave the Titan a period of invulnerability, which meant that Rodeo shots during that time just did no damage at all, so a pilot had to stop firing for a while. And the health Chiclets experiments lasted for a while, so it became pressing for us to see if we could make Rodeo work with it, instead of having Rodeo be in an essentially broken state for too long. Once we agreed that something needed to be done for Rodeo, the design actually came together fairly quickly. Since we wanted to keep the pacing of health Chiclets, it was pretty intuitive that we made Rodeo just do a single Chiclet's worth of damage. This made it so that when the Chiclet threshold would always be triggered when you Rodeoed, and the Titan would have that moment of being able to catch their breath and reorientate themselves after getting Rodeoed. The idea of batteries was also being floated around in design discussions when we were talking about potential systems to limit how long Titans stayed on the battlefield. So for example, maybe each Titan only had a minute worth of power, but players could pick up batteries to extend this time. This seemed like a great fit for Rodeo and health Chiclets. We could make Chiclets be visually represented on the health bar as batteries, and Rodeo be the act of removing one of these batteries. It made the act of Rodeo doing one Chiclet of damage a lot more understandable, and the whole concept came together pretty well. So if Rodeo was the act of removing a battery, it was a natural step for Brodeo to be the reverse of inserting a battery and restoring a Chiclet. It's a simple idea, but it actually has pretty far-reaching implications. Nothing else in the game allow you to help your teammates in such a direct fashion. Suddenly there's a whole new vector for players to contribute to winning the match instead of just killing the opponent. Titanfall had a kind of a reputation as being a game that favored a very lone wolf type of style of playing the game, but now that your allies could heal you, there was suddenly a lot more coordination, more communication. We'd hear feedback from playtests that players would think they were going to lose the fight against an enemy Titan, but out of nowhere, a teammate steals a battery from the attacker and plunges it into the back, allowing them to turn the tables on the fight. And more than anything else, the positive vibes that resulted from this interaction was what convinced us that this iteration of Rodeo was something we should commit to shipping. In fact, we thought this version of battery-style Rodeo was strong enough that we decided to ship it, even though in the end, the inspiration, the health Chiclets, didn't ship. So here we'll see gameplay footage of a player in the battery medic role. It's a last Titan standing match. He's trying to keep the last Titan on his team alive by feeding him batteries. As you see, he's able to turn the tide of the battle by effectively being a healer for his teammate.
You're the last Titan. I'm getting you a battery. I'm trying to get you a battery. I'm getting this battery too. You can make it. Good job.
So another seemingly small but important change that resulted from this was the duration of Rodeo. Since we only wanted pilots to do a Chiclet's worth of damage when stealing a battery, and we wanted them to take that battery to insert into a friendly Titan, it seemed obvious that we kicked the pilot off automatically after the stealing battery sequence was complete. And with this change, Rodeo shifted away from being a long process that happened over a period of time to a short event that has follow-up gameplay. For the pilot, the gameplay is to get away with the precious stolen battery and deliver it to a teammate. For the Titan, the gameplay is to now chase down the pilot and take back the battery. This new cat and mouse element of post-Rodeo gameplay reinforced some of the broader gameplay themes we had with Titanfall. It also confirmed some of the suspicions I had previously about Titanfall 1's Rodeo, that the actual worst part of it is the pilot shooting the Titan's hatch panel. From the pilot's perspective, shooting a basically stationary target, reloading and repeating until the Titan is dead is not very interesting, mechanically speaking. From the Titan's perspective, a general lack of tools other than electric smoke to get the pilot shooting you off your back was kind of frustrating. But now that the gameplay part of Rodeo lies in what happens after the battery is stolen, the weapons, the kits, the mechanics from the rest of the game all play a part in whether or not the pilot can get away, which makes for a richer gameplay experience. For example, the pilots can use the grappling hook to speed away quickly, they can use cloak or phase shift to disorientate the Titan as to where they actually are, they can use wall running to quickly scamper up buildings and onto rooftops. Titans can use their dash to quickly catch up with the escaping pilot, and use their assorted weapons to kill the pilot and retrieve the battery. And with that, the base design for Rodeo in Titanfall 2 was complete. The first major iteration of this battery-style Rodeo was complete in early July 2015, and even though we added more features to support it, the overall design didn't change very much since then. Some examples of things that we added to help the experience are the ability to use the battery on the player's own Titan by embarking into the Titan with it. So this weakens the incentive to help a teammate with the battery somewhat, but it does reduce the frustration when you manage to steal a battery, but you have no teammates to give the battery to. Overheat indicator for the battery for the Titan. So with the speed at which pilots can move in our game, it's very easy to visually lose track of the pilot, which hurt the cat and mouse gameplay we were trying to support. The indicator as of release lasts for about 10 seconds before fading out, which we thought was a good balance. It's long enough for the Titan to not have to drop everything immediately and chase after the pilot, but short enough that the pilot doesn't feel punished forever for not being able to quickly get rid of the battery. An ability for the pilot to call out to friendly Titans that they have a battery. In an ideal world, this would already be handled through verbal communications over a microphone, but this allows even pickup groups to communicate and coordinate to some extent. This was in response to feedback that it was very frustrating to chase after a friendly Titan when you were trying to give them a battery, but the Titan would be oblivious of you trying to help. And since we were committing to the battery being a physical object that the pilot would carry around, it made sense to limit pilots to only be able, to only carry around a single battery. Initially, we tried to just flat out disallow players from roading if they already carried a battery, but this fought too much against feedback that players wanted to keep roading the enemy Titan. So to satisfy this repeated request for pilots to keep roading, we made a different version of Rodeo for players who were already carrying a battery. Instead of stealing more batteries, the pilot would chuck a grenade down the port of the Titan.
Bring that Titan down.
Since we wanted to encourage this hide-and-seek gameplay of stealing a battery and running away with it, we tried to discourage grenade rodeo by making it do half as much damage as the regular rodeo. So for completeness sake, we'll run through the list of issues again and see how it stacks up to the previous attempts. Communication. Same as before, we rely mainly on HUD elements and sound to sell the experience to the player. Admittedly, this aspect is probably a bit weaker than Titanfall 1's version of Rodeo, since the concept of a battery and having to steal it and insert it into friendlies is much more abstract than just shooting into the weak point of an enemy Titan. On the plus side, however, since Titanfall 2 has a full single-player campaign, we were able to rely on the campaign to teach some of the mechanics with batteries. Indeed, the first thing that BT, the single-player campaign's Titan, asks you to do is to bring him some batteries so he can recover from a depowered state. Choice. As mentioned before, much of the choice for Rodeo is now shifted to the part after the pilot steals the battery. From there, pilots have access to their full suite of mobility options, grappling hooks, stim, etc. Similarly, Titans have access to all their loadout to be able to kill the escaping pilot. We did bring back electric smoke from Titanfall 1 as a universal tool that all Titans have access to once they hit a 20% charge on their Titan core meter. Length. So it takes about 5 seconds or so to steal the battery, and from there, it's variable as to whether or not the battery is recovered. Similarly, although for Titanfall 2 we didn't initially set out to solve explicit design goals when iterating on Rodeo, it's useful to re-examine the goals we had before to see if they're still met. So the first goal is still intact. Arguably, the aspect of doing heavy damage is weakened since each Rodeo does at most one chunk of damage, as opposed to the unlimited amount of potential damage that Titanfall 1 Rodeo had. However, the ability to give batteries to friendlies, as well as the cat and mouse aspect of Titanfall 2's Rodeo, makes this goal, I think, overwhelmingly accomplished in Titanfall 2's favor. And the second goal is intact as well. Pilots need to leverage their skills at traversal to get away from the Titan, and Titans need to use their skill in hunting pilots to get the most out of the Rodeo experience. And we think the third goal is also accomplished, although one could probably argue the visual presentation for Titanfall 1's Rodeo is stronger and more compelling. Shooting at the brains of a Titan feels more compelling than a more abstract stealing a battery sequence. The grenade version of Rodeo does help with this, however. And the last goal is arguably where we gave up the most compared to the previous version of Rodeo. A battery is an abstract concept, despite the lengths we go to make it more grounded. It does help that we have a single-player campaign to slowly teach the player the concepts, so we'll call this a mixed success. Lastly, it's also instructive for us to re-examine what went well for Rodeo in Titanfall 1 and see if those are still applicable to Titanfall 2, and to see if anything new was added to the list. At this point in time, it's maybe a bit too premature to comment about whether it's popular or well-balanced. There is some feedback, even internally as well, about people who missed the feel of Titanfall 1 style Rodeo, and that's certainly to be expected when you make a big change to a prominent mechanic. But my hope is that over time, people will prefer this new style of Rodeo. Fantasy fulfillment. Admittedly, the concept of you pulling out a battery is weaker from a fantasy fulfillment aspect compared to shooting the brains of a Titan, so it's kind of unfortunate we took a step back in that regard. The organic interactions of the Titan Eject system were preserved from Titanfall 1, so that's a win for us. In fact, more parts of the game started to have richer interactions with Rodeo's chase component, so we think this was a big improvement overall. Brodeo also felt much more improved and richer, since the pilot now has a strong supporting role. Previously, it was mainly the Titan supporting the pilot by ferrying the pilot to a hardpoint, etc. Going down the list, let's see if we improved what went poorly last time around. The back and forth between the Titan and pilot feels better this time around. For the most part, we got rid of the Titan player feeling like they had to disembark to shoot the pilot off. I think that's an improvement, especially from the fantasy fulfillment aspect of David versus Goliath. The chase component of Rodeo is mechanically richer and offers more room for counterplay than the old version of Rodeo. Since the amount of time the pilot is on the back of the Titan is minimized, there's less pressure for us to create tools for the Titan to get the pilot off their back. Aiming during Brodeo. This is generally improved because the position at which the pilot climbs on for Brodeo is higher than Titanfall 1, which makes it slightly easier to aim. It's still not easy, and there'll probably always be limits as to how good we can make it, but overall I think there's a noticeable improvement. So these two pictures just show the improvement we're talking about. The picture on the left is Titanfall 1, and the picture on the right is Titanfall 2. Notice how much more of the screen's real estate is taken up by the Titan's body in the left screenshot. Lastly, The problem of being able to tell at a glance whether you can rodeo a Titan is still there, but the situation is less of a problem than before, since rodeo normally only has the enemy pilot on the back of the Titan for about 5 seconds or so. Admittedly, a Titan with a buddy on him can still be hard to tell at a glance, but other changes that we made, for example, the enemy highlighting system, should hopefully help with this as well. So one interesting development about rodeo that we had for Titanfall 2 was the need to have different behaviors for the single-player campaign versus the multiplayer. This was somewhat regrettable, but ultimately necessary to best serve the needs of the game type. In multiplayer, only pilots can pick up a battery. To apply a battery to the Titan, it either has to be done via Brodeo or by a pilot climbing into his own Titan. In SP, though, we allow you to pick up one as a Titan by simply walking over it. And there are 3 main reasons for adding this extra limitation in multiplayer. First, it does encourage teamwork a bit more between pilots and Titans on the same team. If the Titan could just walk over a battery, there's less reason for you to need to depend on your teammates. The second reason is to give an element of counterplay and risk and reward. If there are no friendly pilots around, the Titan player has to disembark to pick up a battery, and then re-embark to apply that battery. This is a process that takes time and makes the disembarking pilot more vulnerable. It also makes mid-combat pickups of batteries less likely, which helps make the fights between Titans be a bit more controlled. Lastly, there was a general desire on the MP team to make Titans last just a bit shorter on the battlefield compared to Titanfall 1, and making it a bit less convenient to pick up the battery is a step in that direction. These reasons, though, aren't really applicable in SP, so we just made Titans able to pick up batteries by walking over them. There's some other subtle differences, like the amount of health and shield that the battery application gives you, but those are relatively minor. So we've gone on a journey of how rodeo was conceived, its various implementations through the Titanfall 1, and why we made the changes we did for Titanfall 2. Before we end the talk, however, there's a few other bits and pieces I'd like to talk about for the design of rodeo that didn't quite fit the mainly chronological nature for the rest of the talk. The first of these things I'd like to talk about is the trigger condition for rodeo, and by that I mean how does the player initiate rodeo. The very first iteration of rodeo had pilots automatically magnetized onto Titans when jumping near them. There's no extra button input needed. In part, this was done out of simplicity to get the simplest thing possible to playtest the idea of rodeo. This automatic activation had a divided response. Some players enjoyed the ease of which it happened, but others hated how sometimes it happened even though they wanted to jump away from the Titan instead. I was very resistant, maybe unreasonably so, to the idea of having Rodeo trigger only when the use button was held down, since I thought it was an unnecessary barrier of execution. This is especially so for consoles, where you'd be asking the players who had their thumbs on the look stick to move it to the jump button, and then to use the hold button. It just feels clunky. We did eventually try out a jetpack assist ability for pilots, which involved them using the use button and being propelled towards the Titan they were looking at. At this stage of development, Titans were a little too fast at getting around the map, and this was done in part to help make rodeo a little easier, and to respond to suggestions that having rodeo be triggered by a button press would make it more interactive and more immersive.
Take it down.
In the final shipping game for Titanfall 1, however, the trigger conditions for rodeo remain very similar to how it was initially implemented, with it happening automatically when you're jumping near a Titan. I feel like this is one of the reasons why rodeo is so successful, because it's easily done and even naturally discoverable and learnable. You could conceivably stumble upon it without anybody telling you what rodeo was, and it would, hopefully, make immediate sense to you. In Titanfall 2, this is largely unchanged, although we did adjust the angles and the height required to get frontal rodeo to start. The idea behind this is that it's often frustrating from the Titan's perspective that you see a pilot in front of you, they jump, you try to punch them, etc., and instead of the pilot exploding in a glorious pile of jibs, they disappear and start rodeo instead. And some of this is caused by latency and it's kind of hard to solve, so we just made rodeo not trigger for the pilot when he's jumping straight on towards the Titan. Personally, I kind of dislike this since Titans can actually turn very quickly, especially on PC. So what started out as a pilot trying to jump onto a Titan's back can quickly turn into a Titan facing the pilot directly, and the pilot getting stomped at the Titan's feet. That said, though, we're going to be monitoring players' feedback on that to see if they prefer that frontal rodeo is harder. Another thing I wanted to talk about was some of the counterplay options we tried in the development of rodeo. I.e. what options did the Titan have to get the pilot off their back. As I went through the various iterations of rodeo in Titanfall 1, you may have noticed there didn't really seem to be any new ways we added for the Titan to remove the pilots off their back. It was always just disembark or electric smoke. And to be honest, this isn't because we didn't try, it's just that all the things we did try left something to be desired. Here I'll talk about some of the few interesting things in this category that we tried that didn't ship. So wall smashing. The inspiration for this came from this fight scene in the Princess Bride.
I'll be wearing them in the future.
I just figured when you give me so much trouble.
Why is that?
So we had an idea that the Titan player could use their dash ability to ram themselves into a wall, doing damage to the pilot and shaking him off. So it took multiple dashes to shake off a full health pilot, which meant that the ogre of the smallest amount of dashes had the hardest time getting rid of a rodeo player. We tried versions where the pilot player just got shook off with it, and took damage without dying, but that meant that he could just jump back on again. But then when we made it fatal, it became frustrating for the pilot player because it was hard for him to tell that the Titan player was going to be running into a wall at a high enough speed to throw him off. All in all, it was just kind of clumsy as a mechanic. Here we'll see what it looks like from the pilot's perspective as the Titan tries to shake him off. So you can see it's not very easy to follow along with what's happening. Wired hood. This was a kit that could be equipped. The idea was that the panel of the Titan was booby-trapped, so opening it would cause the pilot to be shocked and thrown away.
Take it down.
So the problem with this was that rodeo pilots had no way of knowing beforehand that the Titan had equipped wired hood, so it led to players just assuming that every Titan had a wired hood on, and rodeo just happening a lot less as a result. Astute observers among you would probably notice that the electric smoke that we shipped in the final game has a lot of the same problems, that you can't tell the Titan has it before it's used, but since electric smoke had other uses and wasn't specifically designed only for rodeo, we kept electric smoke in. Active reload. So before we brought back electric smoke for Titanfall 2, we tried implementing an active reload style minigame for rodeo. The idea was that if the Titan managed to get the timing down perfectly, it'd be able to push the pilot off without having its battery stolen. So here you see the bars coming up. The Titan hits it correctly at the green part, and then the pilot is successfully thrown off without stealing a battery. We also tried a version where the pilot had to do the minigame correctly to be able to steal the battery. Titan players definitely liked the idea of being able to push off the pilot without them stealing the battery, but it proved really hard to communicate to the pilot what was going on. The pilot didn't know they were getting pushed off because the Titan succeeded in the minigame, and even if we displayed the bars for both Titan and pilot to both players, it proved really confusing. There's latency and there's prediction issues, which made it hard for us to show accurately if the other player managed to do the minigame correctly. And on the higher level, it kind of felt like a bit of a step back in that it literally was a minigame that temporarily changed part of the controls for Titan and Pilot. The response to this was not positive enough to outweigh the negatives, and so we eventually cut it. One last thing I wanted to show was the idea of having multiple spots for rodeo. We actually tried this idea at multiple times at different points in the project, but I'll just show you footage of the latest prototype of it. So remember that one of the largest persistent frustrations of rodeo is that there's only one spot available on the back of a Titan, and sometimes you can't tell there's already another pilot on it when you're trying to do your own rodeo. An obvious thing to try to fix this is to allow multiple players to be able to jump onto a Titan. So we tried making Titans have multiple climbing spots. Instead of pilots always climbing automatically to Titan's back, we let them climb to the spot nearest to where they jumped on. So here's a video of how multi-spot rodeo worked. So note that the player can climb around freely on different parts of the Titan, and that he can insert the battery once he gets to the correct spot in the back. So the ability to climb to different spots was important because we only allowed the battery to be stolen on the back of the Titan, and there's a few reasons why we did this. It let us give a subtle reward to players who were doing rodeo correctly by jumping from the back, since they wouldn't have to spend time to do the climbing animations to get to the back. It also let us prevent rodeo from being instant death to a Titan when there's 4 enemies jumping on at the same time. And lastly, it really wasn't practical for us to design the Titans with multiple battery ports that are all over the Titan either. One awesome moment that this gave us was for rodeo pilots to shoot off enemy rodeo pilots. So, unfortunately, although there were definitely cool moments, the complexity cost for having multiple spots for rodeo was just too high to justify keeping it. The extra cool moments you get by shooting off an enemy rodeo attempt, or multiple people being ferried by a single Titan, They just happen too infrequently for us to justify having to make the players learn the extra complexity of having to understand which rodeo spot you're on, to have to remember to look for other people rodeoing the same Titan, etc. In Titanfall 1, when we were just introducing the idea of rodeo, which is a mechanic most games don't really have an equivalent for, you can't afford for the mechanic to be too complicated. For Titanfall 2, if we didn't make the changes with the battery system, it might have been okay to add the multiple spot rodeo, since we could depend on people having played Titanfall 1, and we could leverage the single player campaign to introduce extra complexity. But you can't really do both the battery system and the multiple spot system together, as it would confuse even players of the first game. So we're nearly at the end of the talk now, but before I leave, here's some lessons we learned from working on rodeo. Some of this is pretty common sense, but I think they're still worth explicitly stating, especially for any budding designers out there that are just starting out. First, start fast and start simple. The very first prototype of rodeo I showed you was really simple, about as baseline implementation you can get for the purposes of testing out a new idea. But from that simple idea, you can already identify the central issues of rodeo that would plague the mechanic all the way up to launch and beyond. Also note that we didn't overplan the idea before starting to implement it. Don't write a 10-page document detailing every single subcase and problem you can think of before trying to implement it. Instead, just try out the simplest version you can that contains the essential components of the idea. You find out so much so quickly from actual playtesting. You'll be able to identify the things you actually need to fix and improve on, as opposed to just potential problems. Also note that when you're trying to sell a new mechanic or concept to others, it's much easier if they can see a rough version of the concept in-game, as opposed to a multi-page document that nobody really wants to read. Second point, add as little as you can to make the idea work. So there's a favorite quote of mine from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the author of The Little Prince, that goes like this. Perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. As you can see from the talk, we tried a lot of things with rodeo that eventually didn't end up shipping. Rodeo wouldn't actually have been better if we ended up shipping all those failed ideas. It would have been too confusing, too weird, and too unfocused. When you're working on a new mechanic, making sure that players understand what's going on and that they have fun doing it is probably a higher priority than making it a mechanic that is super deep and balanced. Ideally, of course, it's going to be both, but don't hesitate to make sure it's fun and understandable first before you're trying to make it deep and balanced. Third point, advocate for both sides. This is kind of only really applicable for multiplayer games, but when you're designing mechanics, it's important to make sure you're advocating for both the player using the mechanic and the player it's being used upon. It would have been very easy for us to fall into the trap of making rodeo mechanic focused only on the pilot, one where the pilot could just straight up destroy the Titan. But instead, by making sure that both the Titan and the pilot have their own defined role in the mechanic, that both have choices and counter choices, we made rodeo mechanic that is deeper and more fun for both. And this isn't to say that you can't have mechanics that are easier for one side or another, but in theory, rodeo should probably be at least a bit in favor of the pilot, since they have to get up close to the Titan to do it. It just means that you want to give the Titan at least some feeling of hope that they can influence the outcome if they play well, instead of just being handed a death sentence. Last point, don't be afraid to make big changes. As I mentioned, rodeo was pretty popular in Titanfall 1, and when we first started making changes to Titanfall 2, the battery style rodeo, there was definitely some feedback that they preferred the old style rodeo from Titanfall 1. It's important to not flat out ignore the feedback, of course, but it's just as important to not let all your decision making be ruled only by reactions to feedback. Take a step back, calmly analyze what it is you're trying to do, and see if it's actually achieving it. In Rodeo's case, it was initially driven by a need to make Rodeo work within the confines of the health chiclet system, but once we started playing with it, we realized just how huge an impact being able to give batteries to your allies was. Having a chase component to Rodeo also made so many more abilities and weapons play into Rodeo in a much more interesting fashion. So although I was responsible for a lot of the design and implementation of Rodeo across both Titanfall and Titanfall 2, it would be remiss for me to not point out that Rodeo was clearly not the work of just one person. It takes an entire team of dedicated professionals to bring game mechanics to life, so let me just take some time out now to thank all the folks back at Respawn for the help on Rodeo and for this talk. Special thanks in particular go to designers Mackie McCandlish, Brent McLeod, Carlos Pineda, programmers Stephen Wong, Joel Gompert, and animators Paul Meserly, Mark Grigsby, Bruce Ferriz, and Laura Retiff. Special thanks also go out to our awesome community, in particular the YouTube channels from whom I lifted videos for this talk from. Volan, Cog Incorporated, Average Willis, Joseph Hanratty, 11 Bravo Gaming, Colin Vesper, and OX Soulfire XO. Last but definitely not least, all the fans and players out there, all of us at Respawn are incredibly lucky to have so many people care about our games, and I hope our games bring you some joy and happiness. And with that, we've come to the end of the talk. Thank you all for listening. My name is Xiang Chong, and you can reach me at chin@respawn.com. I have some time for questions now, if anybody's interested.
Hello. Great game and great speech.
Thank you.
So first question was about how long would your iterations take for the major iterations? And secondly, how would you collect feedback? Did you do surveys or just sit around as a group and so on?
Iteration, state, and feedback. So our company tends to do weekly playtests. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Design department internally playtest all the time. Like basically every day we play the game, and then every Friday we have what we call Friday night fights, which is design like basically bringing a more polished, stable version of the game onto the entire company. And we tell people, hey, these are the new things that we added, and these are we would like feedback on these systems. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you like or didn't like about them. We get emails. We talk in person about them, and you generally get a sense of that. Yeah.
Cool.
All right, since you guys said that the Ogre in the initial game had maybe a weakness to Rodeo since it had less dashes, were there any considerations in this Titanfall 2 that Rodeoing was going to affect each type of Titan differently?
So it does actually affect each. Sorry, the question is, does Rodeo in Titanfall 2 affect each Titan differently? And it actually does, because in Titanfall 2, even though we got rid of the health chiclets specifically, like each Titan still has like a chunk, like they divide the bars into like 5 sections. For example, for the Ogre has 5 sections, and Rodeo only does 1 section of damage. So the Ogre is more resilient to Rodeo in that fashion. It takes more Rodeos to actually bring him down to like 0 health.
All right, thanks.
Was there anything that you can share about your dev process on the iterations that helped increase the speed at which you could go through those iterations?
I'm sorry, the question is about the iterations?
Yeah, so was there anything that you can share about your dev process that helped you get through those iterations faster and understand, quickly, like whether this idea was going to work or not?
Tips for generally increasing iteration speed. I guess like making sure you know exactly what you're testing for, and like it's very common to just be like, hey, I put this new thing in, tell me what you guys think, guys. But like, it's better to have more targeted feedback, especially from players you trust. Like for designers in particular, we ask, so what do you think about this mechanic? Does it increase the teamwork element of this? What do you think it has on this other mechanic that we have in the game? Like, what do you think of the spillover effects? And you ask people that you trust, that aren't just like randomly going to say what they feel without really thinking about it. But also people who aren't going to be afraid to tell you things you don't want to hear. If they tell you it sucks, you should listen to them and try to fix that.
Yep. Cool. Thanks.
Hi. I was just wondering, looking at all those different iterations of Rodeo, I was just wondering, is there a favorite version that you had to cut that you have?
A favorite version of Rodeo I had to cut? At the end of Titanfall 1, I was actually pretty happy with what we shipped for Rodeo in Titanfall 1. Like I said, I think it was a nice balance between being cinematic, easy, fun, and accessible. I am kind of sad we didn't keep the wall smashing thing, but it was kind of clumsy. Like if you saw the video, like it's hard to tell what's going on when you're being shook around. So maybe if we had somehow managed to find a more graceful solution to that, that would have been good. But yeah.
Thank you.
And I guess that's it. So 2 things. Please remember to fill out your feedback forms, 1. And 2nd, my very talented coworker, Carlos, who's in the audience, he's going to be giving a follow-up talk about Titan combat in this room right next. So stick around for that if you're interested. Thank you.